Right, let's dive into risk analysis, specifically open air. If you're studying for the OG0-041 exam or just like strategic risk management, this is for you.
I think what's really cool about open air is how it takes us past just like gut feelings
Right.
and helps us use data.
Yeah, ditch the guesswork.
Exactly.
Bring in the data. So before we get into the details, can you give us a quick overview of the open air model? Like, what's the big picture?
So open air is a framework. It helps us understand and analyze risk, and it uses probability and statistics to quantify risk. So instead of saying, oh, this is high risk or low risk, we can actually put numbers to those risks.
Gotcha.
And that lets us compare things more accurately.
Okay, so instead of like throwing darts in the dark, we can kind of get an idea of where those darts might land.
Yeah.
I know Open FAIR looks at how likely it is that something's going to happen and also the impact of it if it does happen. Why is that important?
So it's really about getting the full picture of risk. Like imagine you have two risks. One is pretty likely to happen, but the impact would be small. The other one is very unlikely, but if it did happen, it would be disastrous.
Right.
So open FAIR lets you kind of balance those things out.
It's like comparing getting a parking skit versus like your house burning down.
Right.
Both are risks, but the likelihood and impact are very different.
Exactly.
So Open FAIR helps us make sense of all that.
Yeah, it makes you think about both sides, and then you can compare things in a level way.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got the basics down. Let's see this in action. We've
Yeah.
got some practice questions from the OG0-041 exam. Ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, first question. It asks, in Open FAIR, what determines how often a threat interacts with an asset? What are they getting at here?
So they're talking about what's called contact frequency, and that's a really important part of figuring out how likely a threat is to actually cause harm.
Yeah.
And it's basically how often a threat is trying to exploit a vulnerability.
So it's not just about whether a threat exists, it's about how actively it's trying to get in.
Exactly.
Okay, can you give us an example of this?
Sure. So think of like a hacker trying to break into a network, right?
Okay.
They might try things like password guessing or exploiting a vulnerability in the software. Contact frequency measures how often they're trying those tactics. But it's important to note that just because they're trying to get in doesn't mean they'll be successful.
Right, so that leads to the next question, which is all about, it's not just about how often someone's knocking on the door, but also whether they can pick the lock, right?
Right.
This question is about threat capability. What does that mean in Open FAIR?
So threat capability looks at the skills and resources and motivations of whoever's trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. Like, do they actually have the technical skills to bypass security? Do they have the resources to pull off a big attack?
Yeah.
A very capable attacker is a bigger risk, even if they're not trying as often.
So we're not just talking about like faceless hackers anymore. We're actually trying to understand like their capabilities and motivations.
Right. It's kind of like profiling a criminal.
Yeah.
You want to understand their methods and see if you can predict their next move.
So it becomes less about reacting to threats and more about anticipating them, which is pretty cool. Okay, question number 3 is, which statement reflects a key principle of Open FAIR? What are they trying to get us to think about here?
This one is all about open FAIR's emphasis on a quantitative approach. So the right answer is going to focus on using numbers and probabilities.
So crunching the numbers is a big deal in Open FAIR.
Absolutely, because by using numbers, we move away from vague estimations.
Right.
And we get more towards objective assessments. So then you can compare risks fairly and make decisions based on data.
So it's like comparing apples to apples instead of
Right.
apples to oranges. Makes sense. All right, ready for question number 4?
Yep.
This one asks about the main goal of Open FAIR. What's the takeaway here?
The main objective is to have a structured way to consistently measure risk. So it's not about just saying this feels risky.
Right.
It's about creating a common way to understand and talk about risk across an entire organization.
Yeah, so it's not just about identifying risks. It's about having a standard way to assess and compare them.
Exactly. It's like having a common language to talk about risk.
Right, which is super important in big organizations.
Right.
Okay, last question in this set. It's about how we actually use Open Ad in the real world. Well, what should we keep in mind?
The key thing to remember is that Open FAIR relies a lot on statistics and probability. It's not just guessing. We use data and models to understand both how likely something is to happen and what the impact would be.
It's like how meteorologists predict the weather.
Yeah, exactly.
They're using complex models.
They're analyzing tons of data.
Right, so it's not just intuition or guesswork.
It's about using data to get a clearer picture.
Okay, so we've gone through these practice questions. A huge thank you to our expert for all their incredible knowledge and insights today.
Happy to be here.
All right, that's all for this episode. Until next time, keep learning, stay informed, and remember, a little bit of risk can be a great thing for growth and innovation.